Margaret Holloway was 63 years old with hands that looked like road maps. Every callus, every scar told a story of 5 generations of Holloways who had bled for that land. Land that was now dead. Dead. That was the word the scientists from the state university had used. Not dormant. Not recovering. Dead. Complete chemical death of the soil. 40 years of relentless drought had turned the 300 acres of Holloway Farm into a desert of dust so fine it rose in gray clouds every time the wind blew from the west. Margaret sat on the porch of the house, that same porch where her great-grandfather had built the first step in 1883. The wood was worn, gray like everything here. She held a cup of coffee, the last bag she had, diluted with more water than it should be to make it last. There was no money for more. There was no money for anything. From inside the house, she could hear her 3 children arguing. Again. Michael, Sarah, and Thomas's voices leaked through the torn screen door, mixing with the dry wind that never stopped blowing. "She's going to starve to death out here." That was Sarah, the middle child, always the most practical. Literally starve to death. And we're going to watch because she's too stubborn to accept reality. "It's not stubborn." Michael, the oldest, tried to sound patient, but Margaret knew that tone. It was the same one he used when explaining things to his young children. "It's trauma. She lost her father here. Lost Dad here. She doesn't know how to be anything other than Margaret Holloway of Holloway Farm. Well, she needs to learn." Thomas's voice was harsher, more desperate. "Because Holloway Farm doesn't exist anymore. It's just dust. Dust and debt. Suncorp's offer is still on the table. $2.5 million. She can buy a nice house in town, live comfortably the rest of her life. We can all move on." Margaret closed her eyes. $2.5 million. A fortune for most people. A joke compared to what that land was worth when it was alive. When corn grew so tall you'd get lost between the rows. When wheat rippled gold as far as the eye could see. When there was life. She took another sip of the watered-down coffee and thought of Daniel, her husband who had died 3 years ago. Heart attack while walking the dead fields, trying to find some sign, any sign, that the land still had a chance. He didn't find it, and his heart, broken by the loss of the farm as much as by disease, simply stopped. "God's going to restore it," she had said at the funeral, while her children exchanged worried glances. Daniel planted in faith. "I'm going to harvest in faith." But 3 years had passed. 3 years of nothing growing. 3 years of bills piling up. 3 years of her children begging, arguing, sometimes even screaming, and she had nothing to show for it but faith, faith, and dust. The screen door creaked. Michael came out, hands in his pockets. That sheepish look of someone who knows he's going to hurt but needs to speak anyway. "Mom." He sat down beside her on the wooden bench. "We need to talk. Really talk this time." "I know what you're going to say, Michael." "Then why not make this easier?" He turned to face her and she saw tears in her son's eyes. "Why does it have to be like this? It's not weakness to accept help. It's not a failure of faith to recognize when a door has closed." Margaret looked out at the dead field stretching to the horizon. The afternoon sun hit the dust, making it shimmer like desert sand. "Your father told me a story once," she said softly, "about his great-grandfather, the first Holloway to set foot on this land. It was 1883. Virgin land. No water nearby, nothing planted yet. Everyone said he was crazy for choosing this piece. Said the land was bad, that he'd fail." "Mom, that was—" "He planted anyway," she continued as if Michael hadn't spoken. "Planted in faith. Dug the first well with his own hands. Took 3 months. And the water he found sustained 5 generations of Holloways. 5 generations, Michael. Because one man had enough faith to plant when everyone said it was impossible. But Mom, there's no water now. The wells have dried up. The land is chemically dead. The scientists aren't God." The words came out harsher than she intended, and she saw Michael recoil as if he'd been slapped. Sarah and Thomas appeared in the doorway, drawn by the tone of the discussion. "All right?" Thomas came down the steps, his jaw clenched. "Since you want to talk about God, let's talk. Where is he, Mom? 40 years of drought. 40 years. Dad died waiting. Are you going to die waiting too? Is that what God wants?" God promised restoration. When? Sarah joined her brothers, forming a semicircle around Margaret. When did he promise? In some dream? In some feeling? Because I've been watching you waste away for 3 years, and I haven't seen any promises being kept. Margaret stood slowly, her joints protesting. She was small, always had been, but there was something in her posture at that moment that made all 3 grown children take a step back. You think I don't see? Her voice trembled, but not with weakness. It was something deeper, something coming from a place she didn't even know existed. You think I don't know how I look? A crazy old woman clinging to a fantasy? You think I don't hear the neighbors? That I don't see the bills? That I don't feel the hunger? Mom! Michael reached out, but she pulled away. But I also see other things. I see 5 generations of sweat in this soil. I see your great-grandfather's grave, and your grandfather's, and your father's. I see the promise I made to Daniel the night before he died. He held my hand and said, Maggie, don't let them take our land. God's not finished yet. And I promised. I promised him. And I promised God. Promises don't pay the mortgage, Thomas shot back. Promises don't put food on the table. And promises aren't going to save you when you pass out from starvation. Then maybe it's time I fasted. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Sarah was the first to break it. What did you say? A fast. 7 days. If God doesn't speak, if he doesn't show me what to do, I'll sign the papers, I'll sell the farm. Margaret looked at each of her children. But you give me those 7 days. You owe me that much. We owe you? Thomas laughed, a sound without humor. We owe you watching you starve yourself over a fantasy? You owe me respect. Margaret's voice was firm now. Respect for the woman who gave birth to each of you on this land, who raised you with the stories of this farm. 7 days. That's all I'm asking. Michael ran his hand over his face, looking suddenly exhausted. And if you pass out? If you get sick? Then you take me to the hospital and I'll sign the papers from there. But give me those 7 days with God. If I don't get a clear answer, a clear direction, I'll leave, I promise. The 3 children looked at each other. Margaret saw the battle happening between them. Fear for their mother, frustration with her stubbornness, and maybe, just maybe, a thread of hope that she was right. 7 days. Sarah finally agreed, her voice tight. But I'm staying here. And if you look bad, even slightly unwell, I'm taking you to the hospital. No matter what you say. All right. As her children went back inside the house, murmuring among themselves, Margaret looked once more at the dead fields. The sun was setting, tinting the dust in shades of red and orange. It looked like blood. It looked like fire. It looked like the end of something. Or maybe the beginning. The first 3 days of the fast were the hardest physically. Margaret drank only water and spent the hours in prayer in the room that used to be Daniel's office. The wall still had marks from the shelves where the agriculture book sat. The journals of 5 generations of Holloways documenting every planting, every harvest, every decision. Sarah had kept her word and was temporarily living at the farm. She watched her mother like a hawk, checking her blood pressure 3 times a day, forcing her to drink electrolytes dissolved in water. You're pale, Sarah said on the morning of the 4th day. Her forehead creased with worry. I'm fasting, not going to a spa, Margaret replied, trying to smile. But even smiling seemed to cost energy she didn't have. The truth was she hadn't heard anything. No voice, no direction, no promise. Just silence and the constant sound of wind blowing dust against the windows. It was as if God had withdrawn along with the rain 40 years ago. Michael and Thomas showed up on the afternoon of the 4th day with a man in a gray suit, Suncorp's lawyer. He had a leather briefcase and a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Holloway, I'm James Mitchell. Your sons asked me to come here and ensure you fully understand the generosity of the offer we've made. $2.5 million is significantly above market value for land. In this condition, Margaret was sitting in Daniel's armchair, wrapped in a blanket despite the heat. She felt weak, ethereal, like she could float away at any moment. I'm aware of the offer, Mr. Mitchell. Mom has until Sunday, Sarah intervened, positioning herself protectively between the lawyer and Margaret. 3 more days, you agreed. We did, Michael admitted, but his voice was tense. But look at her, Sarah. She can barely stand. This is ridiculous. I can stand perfectly fine, Margaret said, and tried to prove it by getting up. The room spun. She would have fallen if Sarah hadn't caught her. "That's it," Thomas exploded. "It's over. Enough. You tried, Mom, but God clearly isn't answering because there's nothing for him to say. The land is dead. The answer is to sell." 3 days, Margaret whispered, gripping Sarah's arm. "I promised 7, 3 more to go." The lawyer put the papers back in his briefcase with a sigh. "Your children are right to worry, ma'am. But the offer remains valid until Sunday at midnight. After that," he shrugged, "well, Suncorp has other options in the region." After they left, Michael and Thomas still arguing, the lawyer promising to return Sunday, Margaret allowed herself to sink back into the armchair. "Mom," Sarah knelt beside her, holding her hands. "Please, you don't have to prove anything. God understands. He knows you tried. He promised, Sarah. Or you need him to have promised," Sarah said gently. "Because the alternative, that the farm is over, that Dad died waiting for something that's never going to happen, is too painful to accept." Margaret closed her eyes. Sarah's words echoed truths she had hidden deep in her heart. What if it was all that? What if she was clinging to a fantasy because reality was unbearable? That night she almost gave up. She lay in the bed she had shared with Daniel for 42 years, staring at the cracked ceiling, feeling her stomach cramp with hunger. It would be so easy to go downstairs, eat something, sign the papers in the morning, let her children take care of her, let it go. But then, somewhere between midnight and dawn, something changed. It wasn't an audible voice. It wasn't a bright vision. It was more like a door opening somewhere deep inside her, and through that door came a certainty. Warm, solid, undeniable. A certainty that she needed to go to the river. The old Holloway River cut across the eastern edge of the property. It used to be deep enough to swim in during summer, but now it was just a thread of muddy water that stubbornly flowed even when everything else had dried up. Margaret hadn't been there in years. It hurt too much to see what it had become. But now, at 5 in the morning on the 5th day, she was going. Sarah was still sleeping in the guest room. Margaret put on her old work boots, so worn the toes were almost through, and slipped silently out of the house. The pre-dawn air was surprisingly cold, and she pulled Daniel's jacket tighter around her shoulders. The walk to the river took 20 minutes. Each step was a small agony. Her legs trembled, her vision blurred at the edges, but she continued, putting one foot in front of the other, driven by that certainty she couldn't explain. When she reached the river, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky pink and gold. The water was just a trickle, but it was there, stubborn, refusing to die completely. Margaret stood on the bank, waiting. Waiting for what? She didn't know exactly. But the certainty had brought her here, so here she would stay. And that's when she saw it. There, half buried in the dried mud of the bank, was a stone. But it wasn't an ordinary stone. It was black. Black as coal, black as night, and perfectly smooth, almost glassy, the size of her closed fist. And when the light of the rising sun hit it, it seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. Margaret descended the embankment, her knees protesting, and picked up the stone. It was cold in her hands, heavy, dense, volcanic rock, she realized. It shouldn't be here. There weren't any volcanoes for hundreds of miles. Someone must have brought it, thrown it away, and it had been buried and forgotten. But in Margaret's hands, holding that impossible stone, the certainty exploded into something bigger. It wasn't exactly words, but she understood perfectly anyway. Plant this. She stood there, holding the stone as the sun rose. Plant this? Plant a stone? It made less sense than anything she'd ever considered doing. And yet, the certainty was undeniable. When she returned to the house, Sarah was in the kitchen, frantically trying to call Michael. "Where were you?" She turned, tears running down her face. "I woke up and you were gone. I thought you'd passed out somewhere." She stopped, looking at the stone in Margaret's hands. "What is that?" "A stone. From the river." "Why did you bring a stone?" Margaret looked at her daughter, at that face she knew as well as her own. "Because God told me to plant it." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wall clock ticking. Sarah opened and closed her mouth several times before she could speak. "Plant? You mean plant? In the ground? Like a seed?" Yes. A stone. You want to plant a stone. That's right. Sarah sank into a chair. Mom, please tell me you're joking, please. But Margaret wasn't joking, and they both knew it. And when Michael and Thomas arrived an hour later, called by a panicked Sarah, the argument that followed made all the previous ones seem like polite conversations. She's lost her mind, Thomas said bluntly, pacing the room. Literally lost her mind. Starvation, delusions. This ends now. They're not delusions, Margaret insisted, clutching the stone to her chest. God showed me, he told me. God doesn't speak through stones, Michael shouted, then seemed to regret the tone, lowering his voice. Mom, listen. Fasting too long causes hallucinations. It's a medical fact. You're sick. Let us help you. I don't need help. I need you to trust me. We trust you, Sarah said, tears streaming. But you're not trusting yourself. You're clinging to… What, Mom? A stone? That's not faith, that's desperation. Margaret looked at her 3 children and saw not just concern, but fear. Genuine fear that she had lost her mind. And maybe they were right. Maybe she had. Because what else would explain standing here, holding a stone, insisting it was a message from God? 2 days, she heard her voice say, surprising even herself. Give me 2 days. I'll start eating again now, today. But let me plant this stone. Let me see what happens. Nothing's going to happen, Thomas exploded. It's a stone. Stones don't grow. I know that. Then why? Because Abraham didn't know how he'd have a son at 100 years old, but he believed. Because Moses didn't know how the sea would part, but he obeyed. Because sometimes God asks for things that don't make sense to see if we'll trust him even when we don't understand. She said it with such conviction that for a moment, no one argued. Then Sarah sighed. 2 days. But you eat. 3 full meals a day. And if nothing happens, you sign the papers. No more arguments, promise? I promise. That afternoon, while Sarah forced a bowl of soup into her, Michael and Thomas had a conversation they thought she couldn't hear. Need to call Dr. Peterson, Michael said quietly. Get a psychiatric evaluation. We can't let her sign contracts if she's not competent. Or if she plants that damn stone and nothing happens, she'll finally accept reality, Thomas replied. Let her do it. Let her have her moment. When nothing happens, there'll be no more excuses. And if she comes up with something else, God said to wait longer, then we commit her. By force, if necessary. Because this ends, Michael. One way or another. Sunday night this ends. Margaret heard it all. And as she swallowed the soup that tasted like cardboard, stroking the black stone resting in her lap, she wondered for the 1,000th time if she wasn't really crazy. It would be so much easier if she were. Margaret planted the stone at dawn on the 6th day at 5 in the morning, when she knew her children would still be sleeping. She chose a spot in the center of what used to be the main cornfield, a golden ocean of harvest that once fed hundreds of people. Now it was just dust. She dug with an old garden shovel, her hands shaking with the weakness of the fasting days. The soil was hard as concrete in the first few inches, then turned into dust so fine it ran between her fingers like sand. Lifeless, no structure, dead. She placed the black stone in the hole. It looked ridiculous. An impossible object in an impossible place, expecting an impossible result. But her hands moved with certainty, covering the stone with that dead dust, smoothing the surface. Then she prayed. It wasn't an eloquent prayer. It wasn't deep theology or pretty words. It was just the heart cry of a woman who had bet everything on a promise she couldn't prove. I trust you, she whispered, tears making tracks in the dust covering her face. I don't understand, but I trust. When she returned to the house, Sarah was awake, drinking coffee in the kitchen. Her face was gray with exhaustion. You planted it. It wasn't a question. Margaret just nodded. Mom, Sarah began, but then stopped, looking suddenly very old. I'm going to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. Do you really believe something's going to grow? Or are you just trying to delay the inevitable? Margaret filled a glass with water, drank slowly, thinking. I don't know what's going to happen, she finally said, but I know I obeyed. And sometimes obedience is all God asks. The day passed in tense silence. Michael came at noon with Lawyer Mitchell, who waited in the living room with the papers ready. Thomas showed up in the late afternoon, walking directly to the field where the stone was buried, staring at the dust as if he could make something sprout just by the force of his will, or maybe by the force of his desperation to prove his mother wrong. Nothing grew. That evening, Margaret returned to the spot. The dust was exactly as she had left it, only slightly disturbed by the wind. No green shoot, no obvious miracle, just dead earth and a promise that seemed more fragile with each passing hour. She knelt there, her hands touching the soil where the stone was buried. "I don't understand," she whispered. The certainty that had guided her was beginning to waver, like a candle in a strong wind. "You told me to plant. I planted. So where's the miracle? Where's the answer?" The wind was her only answer, blowing dust into her eyes, her hair, her mouth. She spit and stood, feeling every one of her 63 years weighing on her bones. Maybe her children were right. Maybe she had gone crazy with grief and stubbornness. Maybe it was time to accept that some things simply die. Farms, dreams, promises. She was almost back to the house when she heard cars. Not just one, several. She looked back and saw a news van turning onto the driveway, followed by 2 more cars. "Oh no," she murmured. Michael ran out of the house. "I didn't call them, I swear it wasn't me." But someone had. Probably one of the neighbors who had seen Margaret planting the stone at dawn, or maybe Sarah had mentioned it to someone in town when she went for groceries. In small Midwest towns, news travels faster than the wind. A reporter jumped out of the van, her hair perfectly styled and makeup flawless, completely out of place among the dust and desolation. A cameraman followed her, the lens already pointed at Margaret. "Mrs. Holloway, Amy Chen, Channel 7 News. Is it true you planted a stone hoping something would grow?" Margaret froze. She could see Sarah running from the house, Michael trying to position himself between her and the camera, Thomas with his hands over his face in absolute despair. She began. "Neighbors are saying you had a vision from God during a fast," the reporter continued, pushing the microphone closer. "Do you really believe a miracle is going to happen here? On land that scientists have declared chemically dead?" The camera was so close. Margaret could see herself reflected in the lens. An old woman, too thin, with clothes covered in dust and eyes haunted by doubts she could no longer hide. "I believe in God," she said, and her voice cracked. "And I believe he's not finished with this land. Even though experts say it's impossible. Experts said the sea couldn't part, that water couldn't spring from a rock, that a man couldn't rise from the dead." Margaret felt something solidify inside her. Not certainty, not yet, but something close. Defiance, maybe. "My God specializes in impossibles." The reporter smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. The kind of smile that said she had exactly the sensational story she wanted. Fascinating. "And if nothing grows? Then I was wrong. Will you sell the farm?" Margaret looked at her children. Michael looked mortified. Sarah was crying silently. Thomas just shook his head, looking anywhere but at her. "I'll do what God tells me to do." "When will we know? When will the miracle happen?" "I don't know. Seeds take time to germinate." "But it's not a seed, ma'am, it's a stone." Margaret had no answer for that. The reporter thanked her and turned to make her commentary for the camera, her voice professional and slightly mocking. "Here in Prairie County, a widow is betting her farm, and possibly her sanity, on a miracle that, according to experts, simply cannot happen." Back to the studio. The cars left in a cloud of dust. Margaret stood there, trembling, as her children approached. "Do you realize what you just did?" Thomas exploded. "Now everyone's going to know. Everyone's going to see when nothing happens. They'll laugh at you, at us. Let them laugh." "Mom!" Sarah grabbed her shoulders. "Please, we still have time. We can fix this. You can give another interview, say you were in grief, that you weren't thinking straight." "Wasn't thinking straight?" Margaret pulled away from her daughter's touch, something breaking inside her. "You want me to deny it? You want me to say my faith was just madness, that God doesn't speak, that promises mean nothing? We want you to be okay," Michael shouted, and there was so much pain in his voice that Margaret felt it like a punch. "We just want you to be okay, Mom. We want to take care of you. We want you to stop hurting yourself. And you think denying God will hurt me less?" Margaret whispered. You think selling this land, betraying the promise I made to your father, betraying 5 generations of Holloways who bled for this soil, you think that will hurt me less? No one answered, because there was no answer, and everyone knew it. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of her children talking in low voices downstairs. Planning, she supposed. Figuring out how to deal with a mother who had become a joke on TV. The report aired at 10 o'clock. Sarah came to the room holding her phone with the screen shaking in her hands. "Mom, you need to see this." The report was worse than Margaret imagined. They had edited her words to make her seem even more delusional, interspersed with interviews of neighbors shaking their heads in pity, with Dr. Morrison from the State University explaining in scientific terms why the soil was beyond redemption, with dramatic close-ups of the dead land. The caption at the bottom of the screen read, "Local woman plants stone, expects miracle," and the internet comments, which Sarah reluctantly showed her, were cruel. "Someone needs to commit this woman. This is sad. Religious fundamentalism clearly causing mental illness. Why isn't anyone helping her?" Margaret handed back the phone with trembling hands. "It's done then. Now everyone knows Margaret Holloway is crazy." "You're not crazy," Sarah said, but even she didn't sound convinced. "No?" Margaret laughed, a harsh and broken sound. "Then what am I, Sarah? A woman of faith? Or a woman who lost everything, her husband, the farm, her dignity, and is too delusional to accept it?" "Mom, go home," Margaret said softly. "All 3 of you, go home, to your lives. Tomorrow morning I'll sign the papers. You were right. Everyone was right. But you said you'd wait," Sarah whispered. "You promised. Until something grows. You said." "Nothing's going to grow, Sarah. Because it's a stone. In dead ground. And I'm a stupid old woman who confused desperation with divine direction." Sarah began to cry. Those silent, broken tears that are worse than sobs. "I don't want you to give up your faith." "I'm not giving up. I'm just accepting reality." Margaret lay back down, turning to the wall. "Go home, sweetheart. It's over." But after Sarah left, after the house fell silent, after even the wind seemed to calm, Margaret didn't sleep. She lay there in the darkness, holding Daniel's pillow, breathing in his scent that had almost faded from the sheets. "Did you hear me, didn't you?" she whispered into the dark, to God, to whoever was listening. "I trusted. I obeyed. I did what you asked me to do. So where are you? Where's the miracle?" The silence was deafening, and in the darkness, Margaret began to understand the truth. There had been no voice, no divine certainty, just a desperate woman clinging to what remained of her faith because the alternative was an abyss too dark to face. She had planted the stone because she needed to believe God was still listening, that promises still mattered, that she wasn't alone, but maybe she was. Maybe she always had been. It was the darkest night of Margaret Holloway's soul, and she didn't know, couldn't know, that she was closer to dawn than ever before. Margaret was on the porch at 5 in the morning, watching the horizon begin to lighten when she decided she would check the stone one last time before signing the papers. Not because she expected to see anything, but because she felt she owed it to herself. One last look before letting go. She walked across the dead field, her feet leaving impressions in the dust that would be erased by the first wind. The air was still, almost expectant, the way it gets before a storm, but the sky was clear. No clouds. No promise of rain. There never was. When she reached the spot where she had planted the stone 40 days before, though it felt like a lifetime, she stopped. She stared. She blinked. She looked again. Green. There was green. Small. Almost insignificant but undeniable. A single sprout, no bigger than her pinky fingernail, pushing through the dust exactly where the stone was buried. Margaret fell to her knees, her hands trembling as she touched the tiny plant. It was real, solid, alive. The stem was thick, almost succulent, a green so intense it seemed to glow in the dead gray around it. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God." She stayed there, crying, laughing, her hands covering her mouth as overwhelming waves of emotion swept through her. It wasn't desperation this time. It wasn't fear or doubt. It was validation, hope, A promise kept when all odds said it was impossible. But then, slowly, a new realization emerged. One sprout. A single sprout. It was a beginning, yes. But it wasn't restoration. It wasn't the farm flourishing. It wasn't the miracle everyone was expecting that would prove she wasn't crazy. She returned to the house, her heart torn between jubilation and uncertainty. Sarah was in the kitchen making coffee. She looked up when Margaret entered and froze at her expression. "Mom, there's something growing." The words came out in a haunted whisper. "Sarah, there's something growing where I planted the stone." Sarah's mug dropped, coffee splashing across the floor. "What?" "A sprout. Small, but it's there. It's alive." Sarah ran, and Margaret followed her back to the field. They stood there staring at that tiny piece of green in a sea of death. "This is real," Sarah breathed. "This is really real. Call Michael and Thomas. Call Dr. Morrison. Call that reporter." Margaret heard her voice growing stronger, more certain. "Call everyone who said it was impossible and tell them they need to come see." In the next few hours, Holloway Farm was busier than it had been in years. Dr. Morrison arrived with a team of students, carefully digging around the sprout, taking soil samples. Reporter Amy Chen returned, her camera capturing every moment. "It's extraordinary," Dr. Morrison kept saying, shaking his head as he examined the samples. "The soil around the plant is changed. The chemical structure is altering. There are microorganisms that shouldn't be here, nutrients that weren't present yesterday. It's as if the earth itself is healing." "How is this possible?" Michael stood beside the scientist, his voice full of wonder and confusion. "It's not. Scientifically, this can't be happening, but it is." Thomas was kneeling beside the sprout, touching it gently, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Mom," he looked up with tears in his eyes. "You were right. He really spoke to you." Margaret wanted to say yes, wanted to claim that victory. But as she looked at the sprout, so small, so fragile, but so impossible, she realized something. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning, and what happened next would depend not on one moment of faith, but on a continuation of it. "You all need to leave now," she said calmly. "All of you. The scientists, the reporters, my children. I need to be alone with this. With him." "Mom, we can't just..." Sarah began. "You can, and you will." Margaret looked at each of them. "You got your questions answered. Now I need to get mine." They left reluctantly, leaving only Margaret and that single green sprout under the vast sky. She stayed there as the sun rose, then as it began to set. She prayed, but they weren't prayers of supplication. They were conversations. Honest, raw, real. She spoke to God about her fear, her doubt, her anger over the 40 years of drought. She spoke about Daniel, about her children, about the 5 generations of Holloways who had trusted this land. And as she spoke, as she poured everything out into the soil that now, miraculously, was beginning to live, she realized the truth. The miracle wasn't about proving her sanity. It wasn't about saving the farm or even about restoration. It was about surrender, about trusting when it didn't make sense, about planting when all logic screamed it was useless. God didn't need the stone. He needed her obedience, her faith, her willingness to look crazy to the world because she knew deep down that he was faithful. When the sun finally set, tinting the sky purple and gold, Margaret made a decision. She would continue, not because the sprout guaranteed success, but because obedience doesn't require guarantees. Faith doesn't wait for proof, and the real miracle wasn't what would grow from the earth. It was what had already grown in her heart. The next day she began watering the sprout every day at 5 in the morning, using water from the well that everyone said was dry, but that now, miraculously, was beginning to flow again. Slowly, but steadily. She prayed over it. She sang old hymns of faith over it. And she waited. The neighbors who had mocked before now drove slowly past, watching with a mixture of curiosity and something close to awe. Some stopped, apologizing in quiet voices. Others just looked and drove away in silence. In 2 weeks, more sprouts began to appear. Not just where the stone was, but in an ever-widening circle around it. Green spreading through the gray like hope through despair. In a month, scientists from 3 universities were camped at the farm, studying what they called the Holloway phenomenon. They had no explanations. The soil was literally coming back to life, its chemical structure reorganizing in a way that defied all known laws. "Is it the stone?" one of them asked Margaret. "Is there something in that volcanic rock that's catalyzing this?" Margaret thought of the stone, still buried beneath that first sprout, which now stood 16 inches tall and was beginning to bloom. "It's not the stone," she said softly. It was never about the stone. It was about trusting when there was no reason to trust, about obeying when obedience seemed like madness. It was about planting when everyone said nothing could grow. She looked out at the fields that now gleamed with impossible green. The stone was just a stone, but faith can move mountains, or in this case, bring life back to the dead. 6 months after the day Margaret Holloway planted a black stone in dead soil, Holloway Farm was an internationally recognized miracle. What started with a single sprout had transformed into waves of green that now covered all 300 acres. It wasn't just wild vegetation, they were crops. Corn, wheat, soybeans, growing with a vigor that scientists couldn't explain in soil that every expert had declared irreversibly dead. Dr. Morrison published an article in Nature titled "Spontaneous Soil Regeneration, the Holloway Case." He didn't mention God, science rarely does, but at the end there was a note. "Certain phenomena defy current explanation. This may be one of them." Amy Chen's follow-up report won an award. She returned for a feature story, and this time there was no mockery in her eyes when she interviewed Margaret among the rippling rows of golden corn. "Mrs. Holloway, looking back, did you ever doubt?" Margaret thought of the darkest night, when she almost gave up, when she was ready to sign the papers and say it had all been madness. "Every hour," Margaret answered honestly. "I doubted myself. I doubted what I'd heard. There was one night when I was ready to give up completely. But then I realized something. Doubt and faith aren't opposites. Sometimes faith is choosing to believe even when doubt is screaming in your ears. It's taking one more step when your legs want to stop. It's planting when everyone says you're crazy." The camera captured the tears in her eyes, but also the deep peace in her face. The impact spread beyond Holloway Farm. Neighbors who had mocked began visiting, asking for advice. 3 surrounding farms, all facing the same devastating drought, asked Margaret to come pray over their land. She went, bringing a piece of the restored soil from Holloway Farm, planting it as a seed of hope. And, inexplicably, those farms also began to recover. "It's like life is contagious," Thomas said during a Sunday dinner at the farmhouse, the first in years. Michael and Sarah were there with their families, and for the first time Margaret could remember, there was laughter in the old Holloway house. "Life has always been contagious," Margaret replied, serving fresh corn that had been harvested that morning from land that was once dust. "But so is death, so is fear, so is despair. For 40 years this region spread death to each other, everyone giving up together, saying it was impossible together. But when one of us chooses life, chooses faith, chooses to believe in the impossible, that spreads too." Michael raised his glass of water, crystal clear water from the well that now flowed abundantly. "To the bravest woman we know, to the one who chose to look crazy to the world so she could be faithful to God." "To Mom," Sarah echoed, tears of gratitude in her eyes, "who taught us that miracles begin with obedience, not with understanding." But perhaps the deepest impact was in something smaller, more personal. A week before, a young mother from town had appeared at Margaret's door. She was pale, thin, with eyes haunted by something deeper than physical hunger. "I saw you on TV," she said. "6 months ago when everyone was laughing. I was laughing too. I thought you were crazy." She paused, wiping her eyes. "But I was also dying. Not physically, but inside. My marriage is destroyed. My faith is destroyed. Everything is dead, like your soil was." Margaret invited her in, served tea, listened. "And then I saw the follow-up story," the young woman continued. "I saw the green fields. I saw your face when you talked about doubting, but choosing faith anyway. And I realized I gave up. I stopped believing anything could change. I stopped planting, just let everything die. And now?" Margaret asked gently. "Now I want to know, What's my stone? What is God asking me to plant that seems crazy but might be my turning point? Margaret held the young woman's hands. Only He can tell you that, but I can tell you this. When He speaks, it's going to seem impossible. It's going to seem ridiculous. It's going to make people think you've lost your mind. But if you obey, if you plant that impossible stone in the dead ground of your life and water it with prayer and tears. She looked out the window at the fields gleaming green under the afternoon sun. God can bring life from anywhere, even from the deadest places. The young woman left different than she came, and Margaret knew the story of the stone wasn't just hers. It never was. It was for every person living in dead ground, looking at dead dreams, clinging to promises that seemed to have expired. That evening, as the sun set over fields that rippled gold and green, Margaret walked to the place where she had planted the stone. The original plant was now enormous, nearly 10 feet tall, with broad leaves and vibrant flowers that no botanist could identify. It wasn't in any book. It was something completely new. Miracles usually are. She knelt, her hands touching soil that was now rich, dark, alive. Soil that could and would feed generations of Holloways not yet born. "Thank you," she whispered, "for teaching me that faith isn't about understanding, it's about obeying. It's not about having all the answers. It's about taking the next step even when you can't see the path. It's not about never doubting. It's about choosing to believe even when doubt is screaming." The wind blew through the corn, making a sound like the ocean. But it was no longer the dry, lifeless wind that blew dust. It was wind that carried the scent of life, of growth, of promises kept. Margaret Holloway lived another 23 years on that farm. She saw her great-grandchildren play between the rows of corn, heard their laughter echo through the house where 5 generations had lived and died and believed. And when it was finally her time to leave, they buried her beside Daniel, under an impossible blue sky, in soil that smelled of rich earth and promised harvests forever. On the headstone below her name and dates was just one phrase: "She planted when everyone said nothing would grow." And for generations, those words reminded the Holloways, and anyone who visited that sacred place, that God still speaks, that miracles still happen, that faith still moves mountains, and that sometimes all God needs is for you to plant the impossible stone in the dead ground and trust Him for the rest, because He specializes in making the impossible happen. Maybe you're living in your own dead ground today. Maybe it's a marriage that seems beyond restoration, a dream that died so long ago you don't even dare remember it anymore, a financial situation that experts say is unrecoverable, a relationship that everyone says to abandon, a calling that seems too late to answer. And maybe God is asking you to plant a stone, something that doesn't make sense, something that will make people think you've lost your mind, something that goes against all logic, all probability, all well-meaning advice. But if God is asking, if you feel that deep and inexplicable certainty in the depths of your heart, then plant it, even if your hands shake, even if you doubt, even if everyone laughs. Plant the impossible stone, and then wait. Pray, water with tears if you must, but wait. Because the God who spoke the universe into existence, who parted seas and raised the dead, who turned dust into gardens and stones into living testimonies, that God is still in the business of miracles, and He's waiting to show you that nothing, absolutely nothing, is too dead for Him to bring back to life. The question is, will you plant your stone?